situation. It's a weird poem in which, at least in our class today, we discussed the rhyme scheme, which could be described one of three ways. If you prefer, if you think of the rhyme scheme as the word we rhyming with we all the way down the end of the poem, end lines of the poem, then we hear it one way. It's a sort of constant A rhyme scheme. If you prefer to read through the middle of the poem, we said, cool school, late straight, sin gin, June soon, your kind of exact AABBCC rhyme scheme that runs right down the center of the poem. But I find the most exciting way to read this rhyme scheme and this music is to say that the rhyme happens over the caesura, that is over the grammatical pause in the line. So the rhyme goes like this: cool, we, school, we, late, we, straight, we, sin, we, gin, we. When we understand it that way, what we start to hear is a rhyme scheme that creates a sort of syncopation, where we have a small pause midline and a large pause at the end of the line. So there's a little pause after cool and a big pause after we, and a little pause after school and a big pause after we. And one of the things we did in a workshop today was read it by clapping our hands. At least I did it, and I'll do it here, where one clap is for the short pause and two claps is for the large pause. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin. And I think the result of that is you can begin to hear that here, the really weird and unusual rhyme scheme creates in us a kind of sense of a jazz syncopation that lives in the background of the poem and helps us understand where we are in the poem and invites us to be part of the we, or at least in the same room as the we. And of course, when we get to the end, if we read this poem with that kind of syncopation, we expect one more we at the end. June we have been told to expect should rhyme with soon we, except there is no we because we dead, right? So that jazz syncopation also serves to create that sense of the absence of the we in the end of the poem. I won't go into it more than that. I just wanted to look at these two really, really quickly, just as sort of support for the notion that music has meaning in a poem, or at least creates tone and personality, often in contradiction to the poem itself. The next thing I wanted to mention, and then I'm going to get into the heart of this, is the next supposition that I'm making, of course, is that, and we can take off the Gwendolyn Brooks now, is that all poems are conventional. This is something else we mentioned in workshop today, so it's really on my mind. That is to say that we can imagine that being people who want to pursue poetry with seriousness, we're somewhat unconventional, right? We're unconventional as compared to somebody who might want to pursue a more conventional calling. But to enter into the world of poetry is to enter into a world of conventions, conventions that are so inseparably a part of the act of writing poetry, of the art, that we are not really presented with a choice of using them or not, but we can only use them skillfully or clumsily. I like to think about conventions initially by thinking about conventions in other art forms that are easier to talk about. The ones we mentioned in class today go something like this. When we watch a play, we imagine that we're invited into, for instance, the dynamics of a complicated family in a living room, having a big argument or something like that. And we don't question the fact that everybody, furniture included, seems to be facing in the same direction, right? In fact, if half the people in the room's backs were to us, as would be more natural, we would have a problem with that. So facing the audience, for instance, is one of the conventions of a play, of playwriting or of drama. In painting, we look at a landscape, I don't know, of a church in the distance with a windmill or whatever, fill it in with a unicorn. We accept a sort of three-dimensionality that isn't there because we have bought into conventions. If we walk around to the back of the painting and look at the back of the canvas, we're not disappointed by the fact that we can't see the other direction because we bought a series of, we have accepted that two-dimensional surface that creates a sense of three-dimensionality as the conventions. When we look at a movie, for instance, when the screen gets kind of fuzzy and then a new scene appears, we accept that that is the convention of filmmaking that instructs us that maybe we've moved back in time or we've moved to a different location. All of these are the conventions of other art forms. And of course, poetry has its own set of conventions. The convention of the metaphor, the convention that is relatively recent that exists on the page, that there is white space there that wouldn't have been a convention for oral traditions in poetry. What I want to do to think about these conventions, but also to think about music and poetry and listening to what the message of the music of poetry is telling us, is to begin by talking about a couple movies, one of which has been tested in a lab and shown to be really the worst movie ever filmed. And the other one of which I think is pretty good. The worst movie ever filmed, in my opinion, is, not in my opinion, the opinion of eminent scientists everywhere, is Titanic. I can't see anybody, so I can't tell other people are shaking their heads and thinking that's a terrible thing to say, but I really hate this movie. I assume you've seen it. If you haven't seen it, briefly. If you haven't seen it, Leonardo DiCaprio is a kind of an artist guy, right? And he gets on a big ship, Titanic. He wins it in the lottery. He wins a steerage class ticket. The ship has 3 levels, right? There's a top level, that's where all the rich people are. There is a middle level, right? And that's where the middle class people are. We don't have to talk about them because we don't have to pay attention to the middle class. And then the lower levels where all the poor people are. And my memory is that the poor people are having the best time, right? That's where all the fun is happening. They're dancing down there and having a great old time because everybody knows that being poor is much more fun than being rich. That's not really true. I've been broke and I'm way happier now that I have a salary. But the rich people, the rich level top deck is where everybody's absolutely miserable. They're stiff and unhappy and inhibited. Right, and the ship sets sail, and Leonardo DiCaprio hooks up with Kate Winslet, who's on the rich deck. And as soon as, I don't know, is this a floating metaphor for Marxism or something like that? As soon as the lower deck hooks up with the upper deck, the rich with the poor, the ship hits an iceberg and sinks, and our little floating metaphor for American society goes to the bottom of the ocean. I think that's sort of what's going on in the movie, if I'm reading it right. But one of the, in the final scene of that movie, there's a little scene where Leonardo DiCaprio is floating away like a little popsicle, and the music is playing. And the music that's playing is sad hero music, is what I like to call it. Sad hero music. It's when the it goes dun dun bum bum bum. And what's especially galling about this is anybody who's actually seen this movie understands exactly what Leonardo DiCaprio is here. He is in fact the sad hero, right? He's the hero who's died for a cause that is larger than he is. Therefore, his death is somehow not entirely an unhappy thing, but it's sort of largely it's an unhappy thing that's counterbalanced by its great meaning and import, right? Which is exactly what the music tells you, which is kind of uninteresting. When I think about a movie, I'm speeding up. I'm thinking about a movie that I just think is The Cat's Pajamas, which is a Clockwork Orange, which is a very violent movie. And if you don't like violent movies, it's probably not for you. But when I first saw that movie, when I was a college student, I walked into the theater and was deeply struck by the very violent scenes in this movie. There are scenes in which a futuristic character named Alex and his droogs, his friends, systematically beat and murder several people. And the camera doesn't move, it just focuses on these horrifying scenes. And you hear in the background one of 3 different songs. You can hear dun dun da 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 dun da 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 da, which is to say circus music. Or you can hear, I'm singing in the rain, I'm singing in the rain, what a marvelous feeling. That is Gene Kelly musical music. Or Beethoven's Fifth, but played inappropriately 1 octave too high, at least on an electric piano. When I left the theater, I was amazed at the scene And I was trying to understand for myself why those scenes stayed with me. And at first I thought they stayed with me because they sharpened my sense and understanding of the violence. The same way a black dot stands out more on a white field than it would on a dark gray field. That is, the music coming into my ear was telling me happiness, 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 and was coming through my eye was telling me horror, horror, horror. And I thought that was true for a long time. And then I thought a little bit more about it. And I've revised my opinion now. I think that is true, but there's something larger at stake. And it's something that Emily Dickinson thinks about in her poems too, not that she's seen a Clockwork Orange. When I think about it, I think that part of the unsettling nature of that film is understanding that on some level, the film is accusing the audience of having paid to watch the violence. That is, the music of the Gene Kelly musical or of the circus, both events for which one might buy a ticket, are reminders to us that we bought a ticket to go to see the movie and exchanged our money for an experience of deeply unsettling violence. And in doing that, we become kind of complicit in an economy in which cash is exchanged for violence that is masqueraded as entertainment. And thinking about that helped me go back in and think about some of the things that I find so unsettling about Emily Dickinson, and also some of the things that I've learned as a writer from Emily Dickinson, and that I've tried to emulate myself. I'm just going to read her brilliant poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsake signed away, what portion of me be assignable. And then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed. And then I could not see to see. One of the things we were doing in my workshop today too, when we were looking at poems, was beginning with this very simple question, which often gets complex, which is if we were to tell a 5-year-old what's going on in this poem as just the first step into understanding the poem, paraphrasing the poem very, very simply, I would probably have to say that much is uncertain here, but at least to my reading, the poem is told from beyond the dead. The speaker has died and is recollecting for us her last moments of life. And she's remembering, waiting for God to come to her. She calls God the king, but God does not come for her. Instead, a fly comes, right? And at that point, the windows failed. I would tell the 5-year-old, I do not know exactly what that means, but something has failed her, right? We can take that off the screen. I'm going to keep talking about it, but I have to hold up a picture. The next thing I like to do with this poem as a way of understanding is say, well, can we draw it? And if we were to draw it, what would it look like? One of the things I've learned about Emily Dickinson and many of the poets I really like is that their attention to geography and particularity of image is really profound. I've got a blank piece of paper here. I'm going to quickly draw it, knowing that I have about 6 more minutes left. I'm going to draw this poem. I'm going to put a little bed, right? I had a speaker on the bed, right? She's lying there. There's light in the room. It's the 19th century. It's probably not a light bulb. I would say we're standing in front of the window. Between the window and the light and the speaker, there's a fly, right? Light coming through the window, there's a fly. She tells us that the eyes around had wrung them dry and breaths were gathering firm, which suggests to me mourners, right? family standing around the speaker, right? And their eyes had wrung them dry. I don't know what them refers to in this poem. Maybe they've cried themselves so hard they can't cry anymore, but the them might refer to each other, which might just as well mean that they're wringing each other dry with their eyes, which is not a very nice thing to say. So the figures here are ambiguous. They could be mourners, they could be unpleasant people. They could be unpleasant because she says she has willed her keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, right? Big box of keepsakes. She's holding back her soul, she says, for the, I would assume for the king, for God, who never really makes it. And the whole thing takes place in the confined space of a room, right? On the other side of the room, we have the sun. There's the sun that is shining into the room. And I like to think about this poem and ask myself, well, what does it mean? Obviously, there's a symbol at work here. There's a fly, which is a symbol you're going to hang your coat on, or metaphor, if you prefer to think of it that way. What does it mean to say we expected God to come, but a fly came and it blotted out the light? He came between the light and me, and then my windows failed, and then I could not see to see. And the pictures always help me. It's make me understand that maybe a way of thinking about this poem is to say that the room, the enclosed space of the poem, is something like our own lives. It's the world we know, the world that we live in. And somehow outside of that world is a sun, a God perhaps, that shines its light. We can't have a direct relation to the God, but we can have the experience of God through the light that fills the room. The speaker lying in bed expecting God to come and judge her, at the end of life, to either say you've been good and you're coming to heaven, or not so good and going to hell, isn't what she gets. But she gets a fly, and I've heard many ways of talking about that fly. Perhaps the fly suggests that there is no God at all, that there's only decay. That sun outside the window was just a big ball of, flaming gas. That the dead body has attracted a fly, as a fly would be attracted to a decaying body, and not a God to judge her, because there never was a God. It's a poem in which science and faith are at odds and never really worked out. Or perhaps God is the fly. Emerson, who lived right down the road from her, used to say, God exists simultaneously in all things, even in the smallest fly. Perhaps this is a poem not about the lack of a God, but a misunderstanding of what God is. God did come. It just got between her expectations, that light, and the reality. I once had a student who said, no, that fly is clearly Satan. And I thought that was pretty hilarious. But then when I thought about it, I didn't think that was so bad, actually. Satan is called Lord of the Flies. Here we have a fly coming. Maybe she's just been bad. I don't know. Those are three of many, many readings. But the brilliance of Dickinson is usually that all of those meanings and more exist simultaneously, right? There's no moral. If it said at the end, P.S., the fly is Satan, we would have ruined the poem for us. The poem isn't one that tells us what happens in the afterlife or tells us what God is or judgment is. It's a poem that asks us to dwell in uncertainty and to rethink the terms of the question in sort of brilliant and ambiguous and ambivalent ways. Ambivalent meaning feeling strongly in multiple conflicting directions. Now, I was thinking about this poem when one of my students pointed out to me that the poem can be sung to the tune of Gilligan's Island, which was a disturbing thing, but you can do it. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. Right, now I just wrecked all of Dickinson for you, or at least this poem wrecked. But I once told a group of sophomore undergraduates that the reason you could sing it to the tune of Gilligan was because Emily Dickinson just loved that TV show, Gilligan's Island, and modeled this poem on that TV show. But that's not really true. I did get that back in a couple of exams, but that's not actually true. The truth is that this poem is composed in hymn meter, the meter of the Protestant hymn. And when we began this little talk thinking about what Stevie Smith's shifting meters can tell you, or what Gwendolyn Brooks's weirdly syncopated meters can tell you, here we're hearing a poem constructed entirely in the music of a hymn. And whether you understand it that way or not, on the surface, if you have been around the Protestant hymnals, as Emily Dickinson had been, you certainly are hearing it on some level. And the music of the hymn too is paraphrasable. The music of the hymn is always faith in God, right? You don't have hymns of, I don't know if there's a God, maybe there's only Satan. That would be inappropriate and wrong to sing in church. So thinking about it that way, I think we're in the same place we were in with A Clockwork Orange. The music that's coming into our ears on this poem is telling us faith, faith, faith. Everything coming into our eyes through the complex use of exact image and symbol and metaphor is telling us, I don't know if there's a God or not. There might just be Satan and there might just be decay, or maybe we just fail to understand God. And that is an interesting position for a poem to be in, when what you hear tells you something quite different from what you know and see. And the force field, the powerful force field that exists between what you hear and what you see is, I would argue, one of the main engines driving this poem. And it's something that I have had to keep in mind for my own work when I'm writing, is to constantly be asking myself, what is my music telling me? You know, how is the way I've put these words on the line, or how's the way I've conceived of these runs of rhythms? What do they have to do with what I'm saying? Or maybe more interestingly, how are they contradicting or undercutting or subverting or complicating what it is that I think that I'm saying? And that is my craft talk in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for that. And now we'll have Martha Rhodes giving her craft talk. And just to refresh for everyone, her title of her craft talk, which I'll also put in the chat, is Taking the Temperature, 98.6 to 1200 to 58 degrees and rising, dipping the thermometer into our poems.
You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me? Nod. It's great to be here on the eve of a very important day. I was here in 2016 with a bunch of you on the eve of also a very important day. So it's nice to come full circle. I'm gonna start with a short talk and then kind of bring you through a poem as if we were discussing it together. If I could have the screen share up for the whole thing, thanks, starting with the page with the graphics on it. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, I'm interested in looking at poems through the lens of temperature because I'm interested in looking at life through the lens of temperature: hot, warm, cool, cold, heating up, cooling down, neutral, cold moving to hot, staying there, hot throughout, cold throughout, steady temperature, fluctuating. We navigate temperature every moment of our lives, so we don't usually think about it. We blow on our coffee, we raise and lower the thermostat, we adjust the shower. Our walls are painted such and such color because to our eyes, it's pleasing. It makes us feel good and warm and cozy. But the color, while warm and pleasing to me, say, might send Francis running. Stop shouting at me, cool down, yells Max to Mary. I'm not shouting, I'm perfectly calm, Mary responds. And she means it. How can Max hear her utterances as shouting? Mary tries to adjust her voice. She deliberately reins it in. She plays with pitch and duration. She strategizes how best to get what's going on in her mind across to Max. The phone rings. I answer it. It's someone I really dislike. Hello, how are you? I say. A cold response. I know, and I feel badly about that, but it's the best I can do to avoid screaming, why are you calling me? But I know that the person's heart must sink as she receives this cool response. But is it really a cool response? I don't think so. I think it was my lame attempt to temper my heightened reaction so that I won't scream. So cold here is really hot. It's my way of managing heat. I may not be doing it well, but I'm trying. Instead of, hello, how are you? Or, hello, how are you? I turn my greeting into a statement. Hello, how are you? It ends with a period, not a question mark. I show no interest in this person. My response is flat. Our week together, whether you're working with me or Kevin or Tim or Eduardo or Vievee, Traci, Laure-Anne, whoever, in workshops and craft class, will be about strategizing how we as writers manage our material. It's not about content, not about what the poem means or the theme that's been put forth, but about the poet's decisions, for better or worse. The strategies employed when putting one syllable, one word, one phrase, one line, one period, one question mark, one em dash, one stanza or two stanzas, one section break or none on the page. It's about order of telling, what we reveal and when, what, if anything, we withhold. It's about speeding up and slowing down, about modulation. The week's work together is about tutoring our readers so that they know how to read our poems, from the very visual aspect of the poem to the title to the last moment on the page. So now we're going to look briefly at Plath's Poppies in July. Poppies are those colorful summer flowers. To this reader, they're bright and happy. July is warm, it's summer, yay. And it brings to mind, for me, and readings are always subjective, something beautiful. And there's more than one poppy. A field of poppies come to mind in lovely hot July. If I dip the thermometer into the title, it reads as neutral, warm. July, sure, brings some heat, perhaps preparing us for more heat to come. Little poppies, descriptive, unthreatening, neutral, I'd say. But little is repeated, and that amps up the description and is followed by hell, hot, hot, hot in actual temperature, and in the surprise of it, followed by flames, little hell flames. Can't get much hotter, but Plath does get hotter. Little hell flames is followed by do you do no harm? We now see that the speaker is talking to them, not describing them here. It's a confrontation. So in this short moment, title through first lines, I've experienced temperature shifts. Description turns accusatory, objective. Season of July and size of flower turns subjective. Little hell flames, do you do no harm? The use of parataxis here gives equal weight to the words. Do you do no harm heightens the question even more than do you really do no harm would. I'll read it again. Oh, and I would also argue that if you do see the title Poppies in July followed by Sylvia Plath, Sylvia Plath is going to heat it up also, because we think of Sylvia Plath as hot. We come to expect heat. Poppies in July, little poppies, little hell flames, do you do no harm? So that's just the first two lines of the poem. And I encourage you, as I will with all of these, to go through the poem yourself and circle those moments of hot, neutral. There's no dirty word here. And the readings are all subjective. Let's look at the next few, the opening of the next poem, Mock Orange by Louise Glick. The title conjures up a bush, a shrub, flowers whose flowers attract butterflies. Again, for this reader, It's a pleasant image. Of course, the word mock is a complicated word, so there's a slight edge to the title, but the temperature I experience is neutral. That you might experience the temperature differently is a given. I just want you to take the temperature. It is not the moon, I tell you. We are made aware here that the speaker is addressing someone, and emphatically. There's emphasis on the word not, and there's a drama here. What is not the moon? What does it refer to? The mock orange? Maybe. The temperature is rising because the assertion is so strong. It is not the moon is not as strong as it is not the moon, I tell you, comma, I tell you. More emphasis. There's authority in the statement. It is these flowers. A lot of power is given to the flowers. They're what's lighting the yard, not the moon. This feels hot to me, as if the flowers have some superpower. They're lighting the yard. I hate them. I hate them as I hate sex. The man's mouth sealing my mouth, the man's paralyzing body. Here, Glick employs direct expression of emotion. It's emphatic and intimate and becomes more and more intimate as the stanza progresses. There is hate, rage, inability to breathe, to speak. The poem starts off as neutral and rises in temperature as the speaker insists on the flower's powers to illuminate and to expose the speaker's feelings of powerlessness. We're going to move on. And again, I encourage you to continue reading that poem on your own. And we're going to move on to the next poem. Great. Called Bear. It's by the wonderful poet Ellen Bryant Voigt. I'm not going to read the poem to you guys first. What I'm going to do is just go through the poem as if it's occurring to you for the first time. Perhaps some of you have read it, perhaps that you haven't, so that you can experience a slowdown of how your brain takes in the temperature, or how my brain takes it in. Bear. It's not a big bear. It's not a brown bear. It's not a polar bear. It's not this bear, that bear, or the bear, or Galway Connell's bear. Just bear, unadorned, and in this reader's face. Bare, and resonating with the word bare, as in B-A-R-E, naked, vulnerable. The title then for me is on the cusp of being really hot, maybe not burning, but really hot. Pressed full length, feels big. Against, and the word against is antagonistic, the screen, which is a flimsy barrier. This is really pretty hot. Unzipping it, and that unzipping resonates with having no clothing on, being unzipped, again, naked, bare, vulnerable. It's a hot and threatening situation. There's intent here. The bear is bent on unzipping it. For what? We have to wait for the next line, for a better grip to help himself to the seed and the suet. Okay, a bit of relief maybe. Not help himself to me, the speaker, but to the seed and suet, hung, a somewhat charged word in itself, high by the man. So we have man versus bear here. One is full length against the screen. The other isn't yet in the poem actually, except that at some point, the man has hung the suet and seed. The man who is charged down from the bedroom onto the porch in his white loincloth like David against Goliath. Charged down from the bedroom onto the porch. We have a domestic scene in his white loincloth like David against Goliath. The temperature's changed here. It's funny. We see it. The man in his loincloth is made smaller, like David, against Goliath, the bear. But the tone is shift. It's really cooled down. But only one good lung, shouting, swearing. But only one good lung. That warms up. It heats up. The man is vulnerable, charging, vulnerable, shouting, swearing. And behind him, the woman caught at the lip. I've always stumbled at the lip of the lit kitchen. I think it might be speechless, perhaps. I'm not quite sure. But it could also be at the opening of the kitchen. So we have some tonal and temperature shifts here, made even kind of more apparent by the use of the man, the woman. We don't know who they are. There's a distance, a cooling. I'll read the stanza. Bear pressed full length against the screen, unzipping it for a better grip to help him help himself to the seed and the suet, slung high under the eave by the man who has charged down from the bedroom onto the porch in his white loincloth like David against Goliath, but only one good lung, shouting, swearing, and behind him the woman caught at the lip of the lit kitchen. And yes, there's no punctuation. And that adds tension, it adds heat, it adds some instability. We want to make sure we're not stupid and we're reading it right, that we don't trip. And yet we're being guided quite carefully by this writer so that we don't stumble, we don't trip. But we're anxious. We're anxious that we're going to get it right. Did I phrase that right? Am I hearing it right? And so that brings some heat in itself. We come to now stanza break, shift, a little bit of time now. And behind him, the woman caught. Caught is a charged word. It's a heated word at the lip of the lit, and lit gives light, it gives warmth, it gives illumination. Kitchen, the temperature's changed, it's warming up a little bit. Stanza break, line break, stanza break. Where was my sister? On a line by itself and indented, that's a heat up. And also, it's not the man now, it's not the woman, it's my sister. There's ownership. Where was my sister with her gun? Hot. Also, tells us something that makes the temperature rise. The people facing the bear don't have a gun. There's a screen door between them, and that's it. They do not have a gun. Or would she be praying? Since she prays routinely. So we're thinking, oh my God, it's so hot here, it's so dangerous. That would somebody witnessing this be actually praying that these people aren't going to get murdered, except here it's praying since she prays routinely for a parking spot. And there it is. Or would she be speechless for once? So we're heating up and we're cooling down with some humor, and we're digressing. We're getting away from the bear for a moment. We're into a parking lot. That this man, so moderate, so genial, so unlike me, had put himself one body length away from a full-grown bear. Or would she be saying, you, my dear, are the person who married him, which of course I did, resonates with I do. And I stood behind him. And that's nuanced, isn't it? Behind him physically, and behind him standing up for him as he stood his ground on the ground that is our porch. We now have a couple, a real couple. They're not the man, they're not the woman. They have a porch. It is their porch. It is their kitchen. It is them against bear. Man in his loincloth, just one good, long, loyal, loving wife. I did. Standing behind him, up and down, hot and cold, another stanza break, another indentation. You can see the marks gouged by the famous claws on the wall inside new screen. The poem is cooler here. It's a little funny. The scary story has become the stuff of family legend. Now laced is a softer word by a wire that's a harder word, hot, on which nothing climbs. A vertical electric that's hot, fence, one of us thinks the bear can hear it hum from the edge of the woods, watching us like a child sent to his room as we grill, heat the salmon. The danger seems to be gone. We spiked heat with juniper berries. The other one thinks the plural pronoun is a dangerous fiction, the source of so much unexpected loneliness. That's the heat of the poem. It's the heart of the poem. It's what the poem has moved toward, that hour that appears in our porch is so fictional. It can be gone in a second. The man with the one good lung in his loincloth, just up from the bedroom and down to the kitchen, is facing off a David against a Goliath, and he could be gone for a second, and now the plural pronoun could become the singular pronoun. So we've moved in this complicated poem pretty quickly from dark and scary and bare, unadorned, to some humor, to distracting oneself from the heat and calling up the sister, where is my sister? And how the sister would act, to back to the man pitting himself against body length from the against the full-grown bear. We're getting into the complications of marriage. You married him, my dear. I did, and I stood behind him. The complications of that, and the domestic and the family friction. Maybe there's something disapproving about the sister and the husband. And then the marks gouged by the famous claws on the wall inside the new screen. They not only had a flimsy screen before, they now have a new screen, but it's laced by a wire trellis. There's protection against danger on which nothing climbs, no bear, no ivy, no nothing. A vertical electric fence, heat, heat, heat. But one of us thinks that the bear can hear it hum from the edge of the woods. Not scared anymore. Watching us like a child sent to the room as we grilled the salmon we spiked with juniper berries. The other one thinks, the danger's still there. The danger is always there. The plural pronoun is a dangerous fiction, the source of so much unexpected loneliness. Here's the poem without my interruptions. Bear. Pressed full length against the screen, unzipping it for a better grip to help him help himself to the seed and the suet slung high under the eave by the man who has charged down the bedroom onto the porch in his white loincloth like David against Goliath, but only one good lung, shouting, swearing, and behind him the woman caught at the lip of the lit kitchen. Where was my sister with her gun? Or would she be praying, since she prays routinely for a parking spot? And there it is. Or would she be speechless for once, that this man, so moderate, so genial, so unlike me, had put himself one body length away from a full-grown bear? Or would she be saying, you, my dear, are the person who married him? which of course I did, and I stood behind him as he stood his ground on the ground that is our porch. You can see the marks gouged by the famous claws on the wall inside new screen, now laced by a wire trellis on which nothing climbs, a vertical electric fence. One of us thinks the bear can hear it. One of us thinks the bear can hear it hum from the edge of the woods, watching us like a child sent to his room as we grill the salmon we spiked with juniper berries. The other one thinks the plural pronoun is a dangerous fiction, the source of so much unexpected loneliness. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to get you guys started on the next poem. Yes, this is a poem called The Glass Essay, which is from Glass, Irony, and God by Anne Carson. I think it's a 38-page poem, but don't let that scare you because there's so much space between stanzas, and it's actually really a page turner. It's a really good poem to look at, and I'm going to just get you started with it so that you can, I hope that you'll do this on your own with this poem and with every poem, and especially with your own poems going forward. We start with the Glass Essay, which I think is a fairly cold title. Yeah, glass gets blown and is very, very hot. But the finished product is sheer, it's generally cool. And essay for a poem, the Glass Essay, it's interesting, but it's not a particularly heated or heightened. It feels cool to me or neutral. If you read this for the first time, you might think that first mark, I, is a 1. But as you go along, you'll see that it is actually I. I can hear little clicks inside my dream. Night drips its silver tap down the back. At 4 a.m. I wake, thinking of the man who left in September. His name was Law. My face in the bathroom mirror has white streaks down it. I rinse the face and return to bed. Tomorrow I am going to visit my mother. So I can hear little clicks inside my dream. That feels to me pretty hot. It feels scary. It feels like it's audible. Little clicks is creepy. I would like very much to get out of a dream if my dream, if I could hear little clicks inside my dream. Night drips its silver tap. Feels like silver water torture inside a dream. Down the back. The back feels very distant. It's a cooling off, but I think it's a cooling off because of heat, because it's insufferable. It feels like a disassociation. The back. At 4 a.m. I wake. So we've got my, the, I. My dream, the back, I wake. Thinking of the man who left in September. His name was Law. The man who left in September feels hot, it feels dark, it feels upsetting. His name was Law, to me, is hilarious, and also sad. It's complicated. It's giving a lot of power to that man, and that's heated, and it's also kind of funny. It's dry, it's dark humor. My face in the bathroom mirror has white streaks down it. I talked a lot about that once with some people, and we decided that the white streaks was, we weren't sure. We thought it was from tears making streaks in the makeup, in like foundation, that the foundation was being washed off. So that felt hot to me because that would be a lot of tears running down a face. I rinse, get it again, the face, and return to bed. I just think that the switches are really interesting. From my dream, hot, the back, cool, my face in the bathroom mirror as white streaks, hot, I rinse the face, cool, distanced, disassociation. Why would that happen? A splitting off from self because the situation is so difficult. So cool arising from heat. And then the absolute shift, kind of, tomorrow I am going to visit my mother. There will be a tomorrow. There is something that this speaker is going to do that makes it a little less desperate. And I'm going to visit my mother. Well, how you as a reader react to that depends on your history and how you would take in visiting my mother. To some, that would be, oh, good, going to get comfort. For others, that would be, what the hell would she be doing that for, based on one's own history? She, next section, she lives on a moor in the north. Well, that's telling us quite a bit, right? She lives on a moor, cold, in the north, cold. She lives alone. Spring opens like a blade there, a blade there. Cold, 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 hot. More north, alone, blade. I travel on trains and bring a lot of books. I'm going to stop there. I'd love for you guys to take pens, highlighters, circle words, circle movements, circle stanza breaks, line endings that help you establish for yourself in your poems and the poems that you read the temperature at any given point. And remember, there's no rule. A poem might stay cold the whole way through. A poem might be hot the whole way through, might start hot, move to cold, move back to hot. Just start to notice. And a good, I would love for you to finish reading this. Another good book to read would be Mary Jo Bang's Elegy, which is pretty damn cool throughout, about a very hot and excruciating experience. So that's how one person is dealing with loss. Anne Carson is dealing with loss here. You might also look at Jack Gilbert's book, The Great Fires, also dealing with loss, and look at the strategies that writers are using to deal with heightened material and with heat, with temperature. Where's the thermostat? What's it reading now? So that's it for me. And thank you, Kevin, for your talk. I actually love the Titanic. I watched it probably 6 times, including about 2 months ago. Love it beginning to end. Love Jack.
If this were a different setting, we would go out to a bar right now and fight it out.
Duke it out. So I guess we're open to some questions.
Well, I just wanted to say too that the glass essay, I don't know how to text with all the people in the room. It's such a wonderful poem, and it's all available on the Poetry Foundation website.
Yep.
Got the whole thing up.
The whole thing, the whole 38 pages.
Thank you both so much for such wonderful ways to kick off the craft talks. I'm already feeling inspired. I hope the rest of you watching are too. I'm sitting here with pen and paper myself. Just a quick reminder for all of you watching that you can drop your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be a bar that includes a bunch of icons. There's one that says Q&A. You can also give some virtual love in the chat for our speakers, as well as respond to their answers as we go through the Q&A. So I'll kick us off with the first question that came from Robin Barr. Martha used the term parataxis early on in your craft talk. I think when you were talking about Sylvia Plath's poem. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and how that functions in the poem, in poetry
Sure, I'm going to actually do what my mother used to do to me, to say, look it up in the dictionary. And when you do that, look up hypertaxis. But in this case, you can think of a very good example is Winnie Weedy. Oh, now I just forget. Winky. It's language that's not separated by clauses, conjunctions. So in the case of do you do no harm, we've got evenly weighted words that are coming bang, 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 bang. There's not, and poppies, dear poppies of July, so orange, so bright. Do you really want me to believe that you're not doing any harm? That's the difference. And that's where we have clauses, and it just changes the impact. That's a very brief, but look it up. You can read a very difficult book that's very worth reading by the poet of Bear, Ellen Bryant Voigt, called The Art of Syntax. Why I say difficult is because her prose, by her own admission, is difficult, but it's very worth reading.
Wonderful, thank you. This question is for Kevin. It's about the balance between music and words, that disjunction between the two. Can music sometimes take over when words fail? And how do we do it in a way that is as artful as you described and not clumsy or poor choice, as one of these questions states, in terms of craft and tension?
That's a good question. I think, hopefully words don't fail in bad ways in a poem. But I understand, I think, what she means by word. It's a she, I can't tell, it's gone. That person means by failing, as in when the words themselves don't feel as though they're up to the task of the poem. Generally, I think that I like to think of poems often as operating in the force fields created by polarities. And for instance, with this Dickinson poem, or with many, many poems, one can choose a number of different polarities and sort of pull them out and say, well, what is the force field that exists between these two? And I've just always thought that one of the interesting polarities we're working with is the polarity between what we hear and what we see. And I think, at least in my education, my high school and college education, I was given a very good education in talking about what we see, in paraphrase, and we talk about this symbol and that metaphor. I felt very comfortable with that. I did not feel comfortable in school talking about how poems sound. It's I think is taught less frequently and less well. For myself, the question has something to do with how can we make sure that we're doing this well. I scan everything I write. I find that to be very, very helpful. I scan everything I write. I read my poems from the bottom to the top instead of the top to the bottom, to ask myself whether each line as a unit of poetry is musically interesting. Sometimes by reading the poems backward, you can get yourself out of the rut of hearing you tell your story over and over again, and you can disjunct that, and then you can begin to hear, well, maybe things are slowing down here. Maybe they're slowing down because I've got lots of weak beats in a row, or I'm ending empirically, which I mean with weak beats at the end of the line. We get that sense of trailing off. But I really just think it means coming up with strategies for reading your work and hearing what it sounds like as a sort of separate thing from what the poem, might be paraphrasably meaning.
Thank you. This question is more for Martha, but of course you both can speak to it. Shannon is asking, how does temperature factor into your own writing process? And are there any particular considerations that you make in considering shifts in the poems themselves?
Is this Shannon Winston? Hi, Shannon. It factors in a lot. I like to give readings before I pulled a manuscript together, because it helps me. I do read, like Kevin, I read to myself. I read things backwards. I read things in all different directions. I move stuff around. And I learn a lot about a collection by seeing how the audience is responding to the work. I gave a reading once that started with, "Can you tell me where my car is, please?" And everybody started laughing. And I'm like, damn, I don't want people to laugh in this poem. I read it another time where I positioned it about 15 poems in. Nobody laughed. The room was silent. And I learned a lot about that because they had been informed by poems coming before it. They'd been tutored by the poems I put before that poem to realize this wasn't a funny moment where a speaker is saying, can you tell me where my car is, please? It's not a funny moment at all. I also learned about temperature from people's responses to my work because every damn time I read, so, and this is going to help because nobody's going to dare to do it this week. People will say, your poems are so fierce. Your poems are so fierce. You're such a fierce writer. She's so fierce. Martha's really fierce. Wow, that's such fierce work. And I'm like, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. And thinking, gosh, am I Johnny One Note? I mean, I think that they're dry, that there's some humor, that they're sad, that they're vulnerable, but I'm hearing this from a lot of really smart people. What can I do? So, I mean, what I will do is look at it, see how I can modulate, see how I can, through the ordering of poems in a collection, through the ordering of lines in a poem. One time I actually drove to Provincetown and took about 6 days and wrote in a Plathian fevered rage about probably 20 rondos, triolets, and rondelets, little, I call them little packets of intensity, little short poems that had the constraint of form. And they were kind of weird and funky and funny. And I just injected them into different places in the poem. So that, Shannon, is how I've dealt with it and why it's become interesting. And also as an employer, I run a company. I'm always thinking about temperature. How do I tell this person they really screwed up? Do I just come out with it right away? Or do I delay it? Do I sit down, let's go, you know, I thought we could go out for lunch today, or you really screwed up, you know? So how do we do it? And then every time we plan to do it a certain way, it comes out wrong. But in a poem, we can strategize. That's the beauty of it. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I think as a follow-up to that question, Judith Carr Judith is asking, did you find that the indentation within the Voigt poem added to the temperature, and by extension does form or formal poems, their specific format, do they add to temperature changes?
Yeah, it does. It gives you space to cool up, or it gives emphasis. It can do a lot of stuff. Space, line ending, stanza break, indentations, indicate shifts. And sure, affects temperature.
Thank you. Kevin, this question is for you from Craig. Do you distinguish between musicality and rhythm, or do you consider them as the same craft move?
I think rhythm is a part of musicality, and musicality is a broader term. Musicality, at least for me, embodies or encompasses all the ways that a poem can be heard, can be heard, the music of the language, and rhythm is a part of that, as is meter, which is different from rhythm. There's a third part of it. There's a wonderful essay by Kenneth Burke called On Musicality in Verse, where he makes this wonderful argument about another kind of musicality that I had never really thought about until I read it, which is he divides up elements of language into phonemetic units, that is R and, S and T and N all go into one unit because we move our mouths in the same way to make those syllables. M, W, and B are another way. And then he takes lines from Coleridge and says, these lines sound beautiful, but I had to ask myself why, because I don't hear, unusually beautiful rhythms in them or unusually interesting departures of metrical variety, and he says, well, what I am hearing is that when I read the poems out loud, my mouth is finding rhymes in words that actually do not rhyme, because my mouth is moving in the same way. He uses the phrase beneath the burthen, as an example there. I just thought that was a wonderful third way of thinking about musicality, that it might have as much to do with how your mouth moves as it has to do with what your ear hears or what your body feels as rhythm.
Or reading out loud, reading poetry out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So this question is for both of you, if you'd both like to answer this. David Miller is interested in the phenomenon of new strategies or techniques becoming conventional over time. Do you have thoughts about this in connection with poetry, with musicality, with temperature?
That kind of just, Kevin, do you?
Do you want me to do that?
Sure.
Okay, I think of, when I'm talking about conventions of poetry, I'm thinking that what that means to me are elements and rules of poetry that exist in the common imagination. The same way myth might exist in a culture, conventions exist for art, and different art forms have different conventions. And yes, those conventions do necessarily have to evolve with time. I mean, the most obvious example, I think I mentioned it, I was hurrying in my talk a little bit because I was trying to get an hour worth of material into half an hour. But you know, the most obvious example, of course, would be that at one time poetry was a strictly oral art. It was an oral tradition. Obviously, things like stanza breaks or white space, or this idea that people have that the white space on a page between stanzas is that place where unarticulated thought lives before it bursts into articulation with the next line of poetry. Obviously, those aren't really conventions of poetry yet. I mean, maybe in more immediate ways, I have a student in my class who is very interested in spoken word. And I like to think that the conventions of spoken word are quite different from the conventions of the poems that Martha Rhodes brought us today. They relate to an audience on different terms, and they generally interact with music and voice differently from more traditional sort of workshop-y sorts of poems. You know, my little brother's a DJ, and he's always calling me up and saying, hey man, you got to check out these Bob Dylan lyrics, man, they're poetry, man. Or he's also really into Tupac. And I'm always trying to say, well, Jason, those lyrics exist outside of the conventions of poetry. They aren't poetry. I mean, it's not a slam on lyrics. I love music and lyrics, but you know, the rules are somewhat different. It's kind of like bringing me a sculpture and saying, what a kick-ass painting this is. And I say, well, I think as a painting, it sucks. It's all lumpy. And you know what I mean? and doesn't work at all as a painting. So, I mean, I think these questions of conventions definitely move over time, and they also move as genres adapt and change and grow, you know, and as poetry grows out of music, the conventions change. And as it grows out of the oral tradition, the conventions change as well.
Yeah, and just as a small example, I have a writer who presented a manuscript where she was using the word ilk, but spelled it as elk. And later in the manuscript was using the word sales, but spelled it, no, sills, but spelled it as sales. And that's the way she hears the word. So as an editor, what should I do about that? It's a real dilemma. Do I turn it into how Martha Rhodes would spell it? Or do I, you know, this reflects the writer's ear. This reflects the way the writer hears. This reflects how we take in the writer's way of speaking, way of hearing. So I don't think there's a right and wrong. A right or wrong, but it's definitely something that I think about as I'm looking at people's work, because that exists. You know, that a lot of people are going to say that's a typo. Boy, you know, Martha's Press doesn't have a very good proofreader. So so it's an interesting question, David, for all the reasons that Kevin was talking about too.
Thank you. We have a question for Martha from Beth Morris. What is the change of temperature in choosing between first person or third person as the speaker in a poem?
First of all, there's no rules. Every poem is its own phenomenon. So, you know, you put 2 syllables down and get a word and the next word, and you're in a whole new territory. And you don't know how to write the poem because you've never written it before. Sometimes I have found that it can, in draft form, help free up a writer to go from first person to third. It can get a lot of material out. Sometimes third person can be more intimate actually than first person. Sometimes first person is way in our face and we need the distance of third person. Sometimes we need second person, you addressing self or you addressing other. So it's really a question of what the material, what we're building up to, where we started, where we're going to. What I suggest in poems always is to see not only how first, second, third person, singular, plural, can affect temperature, but also how tense can affect temperature. You know, present versus past versus the predictive tense of future. So it definitely affects temperature. It can be cold, it can be distance. Before I was talking about can be the result of huge heat being expressed in a cooler way. The back, I disown it, I've dissociated it. And later on in the poem, there's a sex scene, which is a very difficult scene to read. And it has a lot to do with disassociation that she's preparing us for in that very first section. She can't start with that sex scene. It would be a catastrophe, but she's very slowly building up to it through the use of pronoun switches.
Thank you. That's so much to think about. A clarifying question also for you, Martha. This is from Moira Walsh. I think it's referring to your earlier comment about humor. Do you find humor and levity to be cooling down to neutral? Can humor also be warming to neutral? Instability / insecurity could equal hot.
Sure, absolutely. Again, it depends on the poem itself, but sure. And we see that a lot in, you know, on the stage. With stand-up and in plays and in movies, and yeah, absolutely. It can be used to form all sorts of different arcs.
Thank you. Kevin, this particular question is for you about the Emily Dickinson poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz. Actually, 2 different people have similar questions. So I'm going to kind of roll them together. They're both interested in the last couple lines of the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. So part of the question is that faith at the very end, that could only be apprehended after death? Is that also what you're talking about in terms of musicality, following the failure of senses and language and things like that, the seeing of God? I think they just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about those last 2 lines.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I hurried through them so I can rest on them, I guess, a minute here. I find that reading this poem and many of her poems is a little bit like, it's not exactly a choose your own adventure novel, but how you choose to understand things she says early in the poem will have an influence on how you understand ambiguous things that she says later in the poem. And again, you know, with Dickinson especially, I think the poem exists within many, many readings that are sort of simultaneously in conversation with each other. And those windows are part of it. The final stanza offers us with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Well, I mean, the way I choose to read that ending is that the fly, which is whose buzz is oddly described as blue, the color of divinity in many religions, including Christianity. So that has everything to do with the poem, gets between the light coming through the window and the speaker who is dead on her probably in her bed, at least that's how I drew her. And the windows failed. And one way to say this is that the fly has gotten between the light and the window, the actual window, so the light through the window has then failed her. Somehow it's not coming through as clearly as it would because there's something in the way. Which is to say, if we were going to say that the fly represents science or the fact of decay, well, that might get between the light of God and the speaker, at least to her own understanding. But the question also is, what do we mean by windows? I mean, many people have suggested that the windows might just as easily be describing her own eyes, the eyes being the windows to the soul. And in this case, the windows might have failed because the speaker has failed to understand the nature of God, even as she is encountering God in the form of the fly. That is, the windows failing is an acknowledgement of the failure to understand. See to see also is complicated. I mean, again, it all depends on how you want to understand them, but they're all true. See can mean to visually see. So if those eyes are the windows to the soul, then we might be talking about visually seeing. But see can also mean to understand. 2 + 2 = 4, see? Does this ending then mean that I could not see to understand? Or does it mean that I could not understand to see? I don't know, but that's the point, isn't to take a position. One of the things I've also admired about this poem musically is the way it interacts not only with the rhythms of the meter of the hymn, the common meter, but also its relationship with rhyme. I always like to say slant rhyme is uncomfortable. It's the sound of things not quite coming together, right? Room and storm is uncomfortable. Firm and room rhymes even less, so it's even more uncomfortable. Bee and fly, I'm not even sure that rhymes. That only rhymes because it seemed the other one sort of rhymed. Otherwise it doesn't rhyme at all. But the end ends with me and see, that feeling of things clicking together just right. And do you hear that as it clicking together because something has been understood by the speaker that we don't understand necessarily? Or is that clicking together so neatly at the end ironic? That is it clicking together to see everything's come together and then she's handing you a tangle of yarn? I kind of see that the music there is irony in the same way that the hymn music living in the background might be irony. Though I've had students also say, no, it's not irony. That hymn music in the background is the expression of faith against which doubt always exists. So again, lots of it. Sorry.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions. One of them is from Zarina. She's specifically asking Kevin, would you recommend sketching a poem before writing one?
I would recommend sketching a poem after you write the first draft and before you write the second draft. Why not? I mean, it helps to understand what it is that you're looking at, and also to make sure that what you think you're looking at is being communicated to the readers. When things aren't properly in their places, we were saying in class earlier today, often what happens is the poem raises boring questions that get in the way of the interesting questions. If we're saying, are we in a room, or are we at a swimming pool, or are we by a lake? Those boring questions get in the way of interesting questions. So sure, drawing it. I draw lots of poems in my classes at Houston.
So cool. And this poem, this was the last poem. Question. It is a poem too. It's the last question we'll end on for today. Thank you again for your generosity of answering these questions. It's kind of for both of you. I'm going to open up a little bit. How to balance things like temperature and musicality, all the sort of rules of craft, leading specifically to clarity and not letting them overwhelm and dictate expressions and quality standards versus when it's resonating with yourself. Sort of like Martha's question, anecdote about the sills and the ilk in terms of spelling. How do you balance those two sometimes conflicting impulses?
I think it helps to read aloud. As Kevin was saying, I think it helps to read other poets. I think it helps to read and learn to read how a poet has scored their poem. I mean, if you're going to read a question mark the same way you read a period, if you're going to read a Bishovian parenthetical in the poem Santarem, the way as if there's no parenthesis there, you have to learn to read what the writers put in the poem and respect it, and not just read a poem like this because this is the way, stop 5 seconds because the line ends. The poem, to really read it as it's scored and to understand that there's a whole lot of tools that poets have, typographical, the Bedarshan, all caps, to italics, to whatever to indentations, to question marks. A question might be followed by a question mark or not. How do you read that? How do you take that in? And that has everything to do with temperature and music, inflection. Inflection's the key word. Kevin?
I'm looking at the question and coming at it from maybe a different direction. When he also says, what decides a quality poem if the term ever exists? Is it precedent, standard, or temperature? And thinking about it in terms of temperature is new to me, so I'm gonna have to go think about that. But one of the things that one of the ways I know I'm encountering a quality poem, whatever, I can see that the questioner is already uncomfortable with that term themselves, but is that a poem I think often at its best exists within a complexity. That the job of a poet is not to explain or to simplify so that I can understand, but is to treat a complex position with the complexity that it deserves. I once had to give a talk about sentimentality to make my mom proud. It was at Harvard, but only like 8 people came, so I didn't tell her that part. But I was trying to think about what the word sentimentality meant, and I think that gets at this question. You know, it's a word we often use to brush a poem aside and not have to pay attention to it, as we call it sentimental. And it's, I think, a way a lot of women's poems have been treated, and a lot of political poems have been treated this way as well, to name just a few. And I had to try to understand what the word even meant before I could start to engage with it. And I looked it up in the dictionary, in a few dictionaries, and every definition I encountered said something like this: sentimentality is an overabundance of emotion attached to a contrived situation. And I thought about that, and I decided the more I thought that that was a really crappy definition of sentimentality. Even though it's a definition you find everywhere, it is just wrong. And the way I knew it was wrong was because I started reading around in old, really bad Victorian poetry and Victorian song lyrics. And I found one that goes like this. Little Billy is dying of consumption in this poem, and Daddy goes out drinking every night. And the refrain of this poem every time is little Billy gets sicker and sicker in every stanza, and every stanza ends, "Oh, Daddy, Daddy, do come home. Oh, Daddy, please come home." And you can guess what happens in the last stanza. Little Billy dies, right? And little Billy's last words are, you guessed it, "Oh, Daddy, Daddy, please come home. Oh, Daddy, do come home." And then for Billy. And I knew I was looking at an incredibly sentimental poem and a bad one, but it didn't obey the definition. There was not an overabundance of emotion. I don't think that you can have too much emotion or something when a 6-year-old dies. I know I'm making fun of it, but I wouldn't say, "Oh, you're too sad about that dead 6-year-old." Ditto, it was not contrived at all. Children died all the time in Victorian London, all the time. And anybody who has friends in the world knows that some of their friends are problematic and might drink too much and not pay attention to their kids as they should. Nothing contrived there at all. And yet it was sentimental. So I tried to think, this is all getting to this question, like, what is sentimentality really? And I decided that what sentimentality is it's the reduction of an incredibly complex world. You know, what is it like to be dying? What does it mean to have parents who don't pay attention? What does it mean to live in a world where a child could die of consumption, which ought to be treatable? You know, all kinds of complicated things are swirling around in this poem, and the writer of the poem reduced it to a single channel of sadness. And when you take a complex world and reduce it to a single channel, no matter what your intentions are, I think you do the complex world a disservice. Which is why I say the world is complicated. Any subject you're likely to write a poem about is complicated, and your duty to the poem is to treat it in a complicated way, which is, I think, what Emily Dickinson has done here in her question about God and the afterlife and mortality. She didn't answer it, she didn't reduce it. She offered it to us in a full complexity.
Thank you. What a powerful note to end on. Thank you so much, Martha Rhodes and Kevin Prufer. Thank you all attendees and participants, and Susan and Jennifer and Abby. Just a quick reminder that at 4 o'clock tonight, we will, well, in a few minutes actually, we'll have our special interview with Gregory Orr being interviewed by Laure-Anne Bosselaar. That is an event not to be missed. And then tonight's kickoff faculty reading with Tim Seibles, Traci Brimhall, and Brian Turner at 8 o'clock, followed by a virtual book signing. So we'll hope to see you all there. Thank you all for being here. Have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. I love
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you both.
Everybody.
And thank you all for your excellent questions.
Yeah. See you in a few.